Hello guys, this is chapter 6, lesson 2. We're talking about what it would be like if you owned your own nursery, growing plants to sell to people and what it would take. In the last one, we talked about where you would put your nursery. Lesson 1 was where you should put it, figuring out what you need. This one is how do you grow the plants in your nursery? All right, here are our objectives. We are going to, my pencil, we're going to compare different growing methods for the nursery production. Some of those different methods are ball and burlap, bare root, pot in pot. We'll tell you what all those things are. In-ground fabric containers, and we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of these different methods. And then we're going to explain the impact of growing method on transplant success. The idea here, if you're running a nursery, you're doing all sizes of plants. You're doing little plants, house plants, garden plants. We're focusing mostly on trees because that's permanent, right? So the little garden plants or the house plants and stuff, that's not as permanent. We're focusing mostly on what it takes to grow trees. And always, if you can, even if you're not growing a nursery, plant as many trees as you can. You know it's good for the environment. That trees eat up carbon and make the things all nicer in the universe. So if you can plant as many trees as possible, plant as many trees as possible. Here we go. All right, these are our videos. Hang on, my desk is like wonky. Sorry about that. Okay, the videos for this one. Production methods for landscape trees. Again, we're talking about how do you plant them and grow them and get them ready for the customers. How big nurseries start small plants. So both of these videos here should be useful for this information. We're going to collect 15 facts from each video. And mouse, there it is. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the common methods of growing woody plants. Again, trees, basically trees and bushes, focusing on field production as a foundation for understanding ball and burlap, which is this one. And bare root, which is this one, and we'll talk about pot in pot in a minute, in a little bit. Those are those two. So nurseries use various methods: ball and burlap, bare root, containerized, pot and pot, in-ground fabric. Each one has advantages and disadvantages to the transplant success. Again, if you're growing, especially if you're growing a tree this big, it's going to be expensive. So if you're the nursery owner and your customers can't get this tree to grow, they're going to want their money back. So you're going to have to make sure to do the best you can so that the customers can succeed, so that you can make a profit. Otherwise, if you keep having to replace the money off of these trees, you're never going to make a profit. And the customers will get mad. Your name will be, trashed online and on all your reviews and stuff. So it's important. All right, so field production means basically growing them out in the ground. You're growing the trees directly in the ground here. The young plants, called liners, are placed directly in the field in organized rows and blocks. And it's the proper spacing. You have to have proper spacing to prevent competition and to allow for healthy growth and mechanized harvesting, because this is going to be tough to pull these things out of the ground. Some of the growers use a thinning method, which means they harvest every other plant early so they can spread them out. But this can be problematic if the demand is low, requiring culling. If nobody's buying these plants, what are you going to do with them when you pull them out of the ground? So some of the impact of harvesting on the full-grown plants: the digging is very stressful to the plants, resulting in over 80% of the root system is lost. And then root pruning, cutting the lateral roots on the sides before the harvest, it helps to encourage denser root growth in the future root balls. So when you know you're doing this, you need to prune them so that the roots don't grow outwards. You prune these side ones so that they grow more inwards, so that you can get this into a plant ball. But then again, all that stuff is really difficult to do. Now, when you're trying to harvest these field-grown trees, okay, it occurs during the dormant season, fall or spring, to minimize the stress on the plant. You don't want a tree that's actively growing. You can use hand digging, but it's really, really hard. So some of the more modernized stuff, you have these mechanized tree spades. Sometimes you've seen those around, that slice through the roots and lift up the whole ball. And then you have air spades, which is pressurized air shoots down in there to remove the soil, reducing the root damage. But the outcome of field production, the field-grown trees can be harvested as either ball and burlap or bare root. And that we're going to talk about those in a minute. So once you start it growing in the field, then you've got to set it up. Ball and burlap is the first one. It's a method of harvesting and transporting the field-grown trees. You take the tree's root ball and surround the surrounding soil, dig it all up, wrap it in burlap, and place it in a wire basket. You have to support it. And then this is well suited for harvesting the larger trees. If you plant them very soon after harvesting, the tree will usually establish itself well. The disadvantage is you have circling roots, which I'll show you some more about that. If they're stored too long in these root balls, the roots can grow and circle inside the burlap, and these circling roots, or girdling is what they also call them, they have to be removed before you plant them, otherwise it'll choke the tree later. And the natural soil in here makes these things very, very heavy. You can't just, an old lady who wants to do her yard, you can't just hand an old lady a root ball. There's no way she can lift this thing. They are very, very heavy, which increases transportation cost if you're having to drive this out to people or hire somebody to plant it for them, and includes the risk of worker injury. I mean, if you're the boss and your gardener, your landscaper hurts himself out in the field, you're liable for that. You've got to cover the pay of his injuries. So you're going to increase injury. And then watering, when the plants are in a ball like this, watering them is like really, really important. You don't want that root ball to dry out. It's going to need less frequent watering than container grown, but more than if it was just in the ground. Now, this is another thing to get around the root ball, the ball and burlap. This is bare root production. You remove all the soil off the roots before you sell it or transport it. The soil is removed using either water or air to minimize the damage, and then keep the soil moist. Then you keep the roots moist using material like sphagnum moss or gel packs. So you take the dirt out and then pack it with moss or something. And so the roots have to be kept moist. This is more important even than the other. It can be fatal to the plant if you let these roots dry out. Harvesting usually occurs just before packaging. You don't want them to sit like this for very long. And you need to minimize storage time. You can't, like I said, you can't just let them sit like this. It's much less expensive equipment than these big giant tractors. It can save money on the containers, okay? Save money on the growing media, save money on potting labor compared to container production. So it's much cheaper to do it this way. It's lighter weight, so the shipping is also cheaper. And it's generally more successful with the younger, smaller trees. You can't do a big tree like this. But the little trees like these ladies are holding, you can do it like that. And those are, again, called bare roots. You can see it. They took them straight out of the ground and got all the dirt off the roots. And then they're going to wind up packing it in moss or gel packs to ship to the people. Now, this is something relatively new. It's called Missouri gravel bed system. It's, like I said, new. But look what they got going on here. Okay? Look at that. So these plants are growing in a lined bed that's filled with gravel, sand, and clay. They have a lot closer spacing because they're not really in the ground, but you have consistent daily irrigation, because if this is sand and clay in here, you're going to have to water these puppies every single day. But it gives you really easy harvesting when it's time for somebody, when somebody buys one of these, it's real easy just to yank it up out of there and dust the sand off. So it allows for year-round harvesting and local planting. So once you have this ready, you're ready to go right down into the ground. So you can use it to grow the larger trees. You can grow larger trees than the regular bare root. So being able to grow these plants for longer, letting them get bigger, not only will the plant be stronger when your customer plants it, you can charge more. Because they charge the wider the diameter of the trunk, the more they charge for this tree, and therefore not only will the customers have more success planting, you can charge more for the tree. Win, win, win. And this looks like pretty easy to maintain. Again, you just have to make sure that you water it every single day. But, when somebody buys one of these, and if they don't buy a plant that day, it's fine, because it can sit in here for 2-3 weeks, probably even longer than that. It can grow in here, and you won't have to worry too hard about the roots, because they're going to stop here at this bedrocky kind of gravel stuff, whatever this is down here. It's a pretty new trick. It's a neat trick for the tree growing. Now, growing in containers, which is what we're more used to seeing, especially with house plants and the smaller plants. Containerized production is very popular where the plants are grown in plastic containers above ground. It differs significantly from field production and has its own series of advantages and disadvantages. First, you're going to need a growing medium. The growing medium used blah, 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 blah. So instead of native soil, you're not just using the dirt in the ground. The plants are grown in a growing medium. You remember we learned about that in Chapter 4? We talked about the different types of growing mediums. A soilless mix containing ingredients like peat moss or coconut core bark, sawdust, vermiculite, perlite. Remember learning about those? This is where you would use those in this container growing stuff. They also have custom mixes. The growers will create custom mixes tailored to specific plant species, providing better consistency and control over the root environment. Depending on what the plant needs, they'll design different mixes to match what that plant specifically needs. The advantages of growing medium, you might have much faster production and greater control over the growing conditions, which leads to quicker production compared to field growing. You can grow these things faster and ship them on out. It's much lighter weight, which is easier and cheaper to transport than the heavy ball methods. You have more root protection because the roots are contained within the pot, preventing the damage during harvest, which, when you're pulling these out of the ground, you're going to damage those roots a lot. But if they're already in a container, you just move the container and you pull it out of the container and put it in the ground. So you're going to wind up with a higher yield. The plants can be grown closer together, maximizing space and increasing the number of harvestable plants. So look how many, if you imagine these were trees, you couldn't put nearly this many here. But even growing trees in containers like this, you can have a lot more of them. The trouble with container grown is wind tipping. It's a big issue. After a storm, they are blown over a lot, and that it's labor intensive to correct. I used to work in the garden at Home Depot, and after a storm, we had to go pick up everything out of the greenhouse. And so it's labor intensive to correct. It prevents proper irrigation, rain or sprinklers, because then you're not going to get it watered right. It can cause drought stress. And it also leads to loss of fertilizer and growing medium because that stuff is just spilled out everywhere, resulting in uneven plant growth. And also they'll bend if you don't get it corrected quickly enough. Some more containerized things. If you're trying to help manage the wind tipping, you can have deep planting. Nurseries sometimes plant, this is problems with it. If you plant the trees too deeply in their containers to prevent tipping, it may not cause issues for the nursery, but it's harmful when the tree is planted in the landscape. Behind my picture, let me see if I can change this. Oh, shoot, I've got my face right in front of this thing. But there's this thing called root flare, where the roots meet the trunk. Okay, that has to be level with the ground. If you have that too low or too high, your tree is going to be damaged. So if in the nursery, in order to prevent wind tipping, they put them in a big pot, plant them deep, then when the person takes it home to plant it in their forever home, you're going to have issues with this flare. So some of the solutions to wind tipping is stacking the rows of containers. I'm sorry, hang on one second. Sorry about that. Stacking the rows of containers and running pipes alongside for support. So they have these wooden planks here in the ground, and then they have wire or rope or something going along between here. It looks like maybe landscape rope, I don't know, but to help hold them up to keep them from tipping over. Okay, so you got to do something to prevent that. Now, the other problem we said that was going to happen with containered roots is that circling roots, or the girdling effect. And that's another problem with containerized shipping. The black plastic pots are what we commonly see, but they can cause the root to grow in this circle thing right here. The circling roots are going to hinder establishment after planting and can develop girdling roots. So if they're just circling, that's fine or manageable. If they start girdling, that means they're going to start suffocating the tree. They're going to restrict nutrient and water flow, potentially killing the plant and making it more vulnerable to wind damage. Because especially if you're talking a big giant tree, if a big giant tree, say an oak or something, has been in your yard, but the trees have been growing around it instead of growing out to support it, it's going to fall over if you have a big storm. more easily than if the roots were able to spread out and attach into the ground. If you have girdling roots, even if the plant is steady growing, if those girdling roots are continuing to grow in a circle even after you've planted it, um, it's more likely in a big storm they can fall over. All right, so some of the solutions to this circling root problem. You do root pruning before you plant it. You just break up and tease the circling roots. You don't have to, just kind of pull them apart. Um, it is the whole outer inch of the root ball has to be sliced with a spade to remove them entirely. So you don't, the smaller plants you can tease it out like this, but bigger plants you're going to have to cut the whole outer inch, and that of course going to be a lot of stress on the plant. So to prevent this, potting on early. So you're going to replant the pots into larger containers before they become root bound. So every so often you have to expand them so the roots can continue to stress. When you are repotting the plant, you need to remove those circling roots. Okay, if it's already started circling, you got to remove them before planting it into a larger pot, or it'll just continue. There's this thing called these root pruning containers. You see this where they've got these air slices in them, and some of them look like pokey bits coming on the side. They prevent the circling roots from forming. Somehow or another, having the air reaching these keeps them from circling. So you can either do chemical root pruning. They're coated with a chemical, usually copper, that's going to kill the root tips on these plants like this, or air pruning with the holes or slits to expose the root tips to air, causing them to die back and promote branching. So when they hit the air here, they die back, and therefore they're going to, instead of growing in a circle, they're going to branch out. This is the air pruning containers. All right, so the next part of containerized growing. Again, we're imagining we're building a nursery, or we're running a nursery. If we decide to run with container pots, one of the main things is going to be moderating the temperature. Whether it gets too cold or too hot, you're going to kill your plants. These temperature extremes in container plants, they're very vulnerable because they're not insulated in the ground like field-grown plants. The ground maintains a 50 to 60 degree temperature year round, and therefore the plants and stuff that are in the ground have that insulation. 50 to 60 is perfect, whether it's not too hot, not too cold. But in those black pots, especially in the summer, those black pots, they're going to start cooking in there, damaging or killing the roots. And in winter, it's exposed to the cold temperatures because it's blowing all around these pots before they can fully acclimate, causing damage that way. So some of the solutions are these high tunnels. You see this? It's like this. This right here is one of the high tunnels. A poly house used to protect the plants from heat and cold. Plastic film over a frame to trap the solar heat, keeping it warm inside in the winter. So that's what you do. You put this plastic film, and the sunlight comes in here, warming up the little garden area. And in winter and colder climates, you can also use straw or mulch or insulated foam around the pots. And then for ventilation on warmer days, you're going to pull up the sides or the top of this thing to let the air come through to release any hot air that's built up, and it helps the plants adjust to the outside temperatures. Then in spring and summer, the plastic covering is going to be replaced with a shade cloth to provide shade and reduce the heat. So you have to change the film, change the covering. But that is definitely a way to protect those containerized pots from the temperatures, hot or cold. And this next thing is called pot in pot. It's a variation of container growing that offers several advantages. Do you see this? They've put the pots in the ground. The plant is still in the pot, so you don't have to worry about damaging the roots when you sell it. But there's like a secondary pot in here in the ground, so you just lift up this whole pot. The containerized pot is placed inside a slightly larger container that's buried in the ground. So you get temperature moderation. The surrounding soil insulates the inner pot, protecting the roots from extreme heat and cold. And it eliminates the need for additional winter protection or high tunnels. You can leave this pretty much out in the world because the ground is insulating the roots. It eliminates wind tipping because this outer pot is buried in the ground. The plants are much stable and won't blow over. It allows for efficient watering. I don't know if you can see it. They have a watering system in every single one of these pots. You see these little black wires here. I've written all over the place, so it's kind of hard to see. But there's irrigation in every single pot, reducing water waste and runoff. And so you have very easy harvesting. These plants are harvested simply by lifting the inner container out of the buried pot, and then you can put another one in it to start growing and selling. You leave the outer, looks like they've made holes in the concrete, and then they put the pots in the concrete. Looks like that's one way to do it. There's more than one way, but that looks like a really good plan. Pot in pot production. And we're not talking about that kind of pot. You know this. Don't be stupid. Okay. All right. So this in-ground fabric. Now this is not a pot actually. This is a fabric that will decompose as the plant grows. So you don't even have to take it out of this container. It's fabric. So the in-ground fabric containers are an alternative to traditional planting. So the process, the young plants, again, the young plants are called liners. I don't know why they're called liners, but that's what the little plants, you line them up like that, are planted in fabric containers filled with native soil and then placed directly in the ground. The plants develop extensive root systems comparable to or even exceeding the ball and burlap, but they have small, more manageable root ball, so therefore they're lighter and easier to ship. You have reduced transplant shock because the root ball is more compact and intact. You don't have to break it up. So there's less root loss during the harvesting, which reduces the transplant shock, which is a major cause of what makes them fail when you transplant them. And less root growth means better hormone production, and which is important for shoot growth. So if you have less roots, you're going to have more shoots, and that's what you need for your trees. Again, the bigger the tree is, the more you can charge for it. Pretty good plan. If your tree's spending all of its energy growing its roots, it's not going to be growing its stem and such. So in-ground fabric containers, continuing. So you have types of fabric containers. Some of them prevent the roots from growing something out of the bag, promoting a dense fibrous root system easier for harvesting. Others allow the roots to grow beyond the bag, like I said, to just grow right on out. Irrigation for these, they require a lot more supplemental watering than the field-grown plants because their root growth is somewhat restricted. Harvesting with the grower, they dig around the bag, cut any roots that have grown through the fabric, and then lift the plant and the bag out of the ground, and they can be sold in their bags or potted into plastic containers. Now you have this thing called hardening off. We have this in several cases within this lesson, and I think in the next lesson as well. So paying attention to hardening off. These plants that are grown in fabric must be hardened off for several weeks before they're harvested. That means that allows them to recover from any root loss before being planted. So hardening off is a process that, because when you first pull them out of the ground, all of those roots are raw, especially some of them been growing out of the bag. So you have to have it out of the bag for a certain amount of time to help it harden off so that when you plant it, you have the any trauma is handled before you have to before your customers plant it. Now again, with just like my other class, the other lesson, we have a summary at the end, which is basically this short version of what I've already covered. So as I go through this, I'm just going to kind of fly through this last little bit. It's a reminder of what we did in the short version of it. So we talked about the different methods, ball and burlap, bare root, and every method has its own advantages and disadvantages. We talked about those specifically. The liners, the young plants in field production, the liners are in directly rows. You have to have proper spacing and root pruning. Digging, though, is traumatic for the trees. You're going to lose 80% of the roots, so they use these mechanized tree spades. The field-grown trees can be harvested and then put ball and burlap or bare root either way. If you're going to use ball and burlap, you have that root ball with surrounding soil wrapped in burlap and put in a wire basket. This is really good for the larger trees, and it has good root establishment, but the potential for circling roots is sitting in here, and especially if you leave it for extended periods in this root ball before you plant it. You have to have regular watering, but less frequently than container, but more frequently than field. It's much heavier than the other methods, causing transportation and worker damage, and you can't have the old ladies planting it. You'll have to do it for them. Now, if you're going to use bare root, the soil is removed after just before delivery. The roots have to be kept moist to keep from drying out. The harvesting and shipping is much less expensive, and it's really good for the small trees. One of the bare root systems is that Missouri gravel bed system, where they're basically bare root, but you've got them planted in this clay and sand and stuff, so that they're not sitting there just out drying out. You have to keep them watered really, really well. But it's really, really easy when somebody buys one to pull it out and just rinse it off. So it's good to hold them until they're bought, and then once they are bought, it's really easy. So this Missouri gravel bed system is a really good plan. Oh, that's tiny. Sorry. All right, so the containerized is the black plastic, usually filled with soilless growing media, and you can make custom media depending on what your plant needs. It's much faster than field growing and lighter than ball and burlap, which reduces transportation cost. The roots are contained within the pot, preventing harvest damage, and you have a higher yield because you can put them closer together. But the problems with this, you have wind tipping, requiring staking or other solutions. You have circling roots requiring special root pruning. And then you have temperature extremes because they're not in the ground. You have to protect them with high tunnels or other things like that. And then the root pruning containers for either chemical or air pruning are going to promote lateral growth rather than circling growth. Okay, pot in pot. The plants in containers are placed within larger containers buried in the ground. This will insulate them from the surrounding soil, moderating temperatures. It eliminates wind tipping, and it's efficient for irrigation and reduced water loss, and the harvesting is very easy. Now, in-ground containers, in-ground fabric containers, the liners are planted in fabric, filled with native soil, and then planted in the ground. They are able to develop extensive root systems similar to or exceeding what you get from ball and burlap. They have a smaller root ball volume than the ball and burlap, making them easier to handle, and it requires much more irrigation than traditional field, and it also requires the hardening off period after harvest. That's it. All right, so if I went through something too fast, check it again, but otherwise you've got your section, what was that, section 2? All righty, section 3 will be coming up shortly. See you the next time.